Okay, I think some people may be still joining us, but we'll start right ahead because we only have 45 minutes for this webinar. Good morning. Thank you for joining us at this webinar, Adapting New Challenges, U.S. Japan Defense Cooperation. My name is Yuki Tatsumi. I'm a co-director of the East Asia program here at Stinson, and I'm also dual-hatted as the director of Japan program at the center. And good morning to everyone in the U.S. Good evening for those of you who may be channeling from Asia. This morning or this evening in Asia, I'm extremely privileged to have two wonderful speakers to share their thoughts with us on how the recent emergency that we've seen from the COVID-19 might be affecting U.S. and Japanese defense posture, and then also in that extension, a bilateral defense cooperation between the two countries. From Tokyo, thank you, General Isobe. Late this evening, we have Lieutenant General Koichi, who was formerly a commanding general of the Ground Defense Forces Eastern Army before he retired after 30-plus service from the Defense Force. From U.S. side, I'm equally privileged to have Admiral Scott Swift, who retired as the commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, and they have worked closely together during the Operation Tomodachi several years ago. So they do have a very on-hand experience on the defense cooperation in the time of the emergencies. So I'm very looking forward to hearing both gentlemen's thoughts. So thank you, thank you, General Isobe, for joining us this morning. Before we start, a couple of the procedural announcements. When you do have questions, you will see at the bottom of the screen the Q&A icon. Please use this icon to type in your questions. And I would like to ask that you state your name and keep your questions short so that I can accommodate as many questions that you may have. And then also, what I'm going to do is I will pose the couple of opening questions and get their initial thoughts, and then go right into the Q&A. So with that, I guess to both of you, let me start by asking, we just seen I guess in a sense, we're still seeing how the recent surge of the coronavirus and how quickly it spread is still affecting our day-to-day lives. But in your perspective, how does public health emergencies like this will have an impact on the your respective military's operational readiness? I'll maybe start with you, General Isobe.
Good morning, Admiral Swift, Yuki-san, and ladies and gentlemen. It is my great privilege and great experience talking with American colleagues. So I would like to explain positive aspects and also the other aspects we should pay attention to. The first one, the positive aspects, the self-defense forces has done a great job during the coronavirus response. Let me point out two things. One is that among the 250,000 personnel of the self-defense force, only 13 personnel is the number of cases. I think it means that the self-defense force has demonstrated the high morale and the rigid discipline. And the second point is that no self-defense personnel has become positive during the relief operations, such as cruiser ship Diamond Princess relief operations, and also the PCR tests assistance. So I think I would like to compliment self-defense forces very quick and professional response to the novel virus. The other aspects I think we should pay attention to is 3 points. One is that even in a pandemic situation, People's Liberation Army's military activities is very robust and active in East and China Seas. The intrusion by the Chinese government vessels into the contiguous zones around Senkaku from January to March this year increased by 50% from the same period last year. And second aspect is that the biological weapons have been kept behind the scenes. But I think the biological weapons are now emerging. And some of the totalitarian regime leaders may think that the biological weapons are very effective, or because it is very difficult to identify who spread the virus. The third point, maybe I should ask, like to hear Admiral Swift's thought on this. For example, the submarines and the surface ships are vulnerable to infectious diseases. So I'm wondering, submarines or surface ships would become unmanned, or the personal saving ways. So I'd like to hear that point.
So cool. Let me, I'll answer Admiral General Isabe's question on unmanned first, and then Yuki, if it's okay, expand my answers to the broader question of the impact of the virus response on the U.S. Japanese relationship. I apologize, it's a bit of a long answer because I think we have to go back to Tomodachi to understand the implications of what we know now. So the Japanese Self-Defense Force has been very proactive in exploring appropriate ways to embrace unmanned capabilities within the military forces, and I know they have looked at Japanese industry as a kind of a leading edge example of how it can be incorporated unmanned in meaningful ways, thinking specifically of robotics, which Japan has been a leader in, certainly in the industrial domain. The Japanese Self-Defense Force has been very interested in unmanned from a very early stage because of the challenges of recruiting, a population that is not growing at a level that can sustain the national security burdens that are being shouldered by the Self-Defense Force. So I think the impact of the virus on organizations that are unable to social distance is another impetus to increase our efforts to look at how we can pursue unmanned. Those efforts are continuing already, despite this new dynamic of the value of unmanned units that is demonstrated by what has happened with the virus. We've seen that in Guam with our carrier and the impact on the crew there as just one example. There are control mechanisms before a U.S. ship deploys. The crew is contained within the ship for 14 days before it leaves the port, before it leaves the pier, as a matter of fact, to make sure that the virus is not within the crew. If it is, that crew member can be easily removed and tracking done to see who that crew member could have become in contact with. In the submarine community, it's even more significant controls in place because they're underway for so much a longer, regularly on a 3-month period. And it's very difficult if there was an outbreak on a submarine to control that. The submarine would have to return. Sometimes it takes days, if not weeks, to return from mission before a crew member can be removed. So I think this is an excellent point, and it just serves to reinforce the continued focus of moving towards unmanned. I will voice a concern that it's important that we just don't embrace unmanned platforms for the sake of being unmanned. There should be a clear understanding of value added in pursuing unmanned. And I think previous efforts on the U.S. side have been somewhat premature, that the technology has not been there to support broader unmanned platforms that serve multi-missions. If you look at the Aegis weapon system and what we have with both of our destroyers and cruisers, the concept of unmanning a vessel that large, it will take time and experimentation, small steps. Sea Hunter is an example on the U.S. side where we are exploring that capability. To the broader question of the impact of the coronavirus on the relationship, certainly the national security relationship, the national defense relationship, and the self-defense force and U.S. military relationship, I think it's another affirmation of really the revolutionary change that occurred when the Great Eastern Earthquake impacted Japan. And I think there were many strategic changes that occurred because of that. One is a deeper understanding of the Japanese people, of the value that the self-defense force brought to the nation, to Japan, as a national security element, not just a defense element. And I think too oftentimes we talk about national defense in the same context that we talk about national security, and those are two very different things. But if you look at the efforts of the self-defense force, it was across the whole of government to shore up communities, to reassure the people of Japan, to allow the prime minister to demonstrate how quickly the government can respond in support of people. And what happened is that the U.S. approach was to take very much a supporting role. It goes back to the leadership at PACOM and the leadership of the Joint Staff, Japanese Joint Staff at the time, recognizing that the Japanese leadership would always be in the lead, and the U.S. military forces, PACOM forces at the time, would be in support. General Isabe was the J5 on the Joint Staff. I was at the J3 at PACOM. The J3 on the Japanese Joint Staff was General Hironaka, and that started our relationship. We served together when I was at 7th Fleet. The Isabe and I remained close friends. He commanded the Eastern Army, as you described, and we remained close when I was the PAC Fleet commander. The last time I saw him in person is when he was teaching at Harvard University. He had retired, and I had retired, and I was teaching at MIT. So that connects back to the response to the virus. I would say that, in my personal opinion, is that the Japanese response, not just on the self-defense side, as General Isabe pointed out, but I think on the broader national side, the response from the prime minister and the government has been much more coherent, much easier to understand, even from someone outside looking in. I'm sure it was the case for the Japanese people as well, compared to what the U.S. response has been. And so here we have another case where Japan is more in the lead of understanding how to control this. Now, there may be factors that are different, smaller population, but in the context, scope, and scale, I think it's still a valid comparison. This is what the strength of the relationship is, and I'll tie it back to a national security piece that if one country doesn't depend upon the other to act in its own interests. That's true of the coronavirus. That Japan has emerged, I think, from the shadow of the United States that goes all the way back to the efforts of MacArthur at the end of World War II. And we've seen that in the coronavirus. We've also seen it in the Free and Open Pacific, an initiative of Prime Minister Abe, where the U.S. turned inward after the last election. And many of my friends in Asia would ask me, where is U.S. leadership? It's critically important now. And Abe spent a lot of time communicating directly with the president in person, coming to the United States. But he had to move forward with his initiative based on the national security issues, as General Isebe pointed out, that Japan has been facing over a long period of time. But let's just focus on the last 3 years, and came forward with his a Free and Open Pacific initiative, which has been embraced throughout the region, including the United States. So this is a long setup to the answer to the question. The relationship is very strong, where it's not a codependent relationship anymore. We have very close relationships, self-defense force to military. My experience with General Isebe is not unique. There are many close personal relationships between key leaders and general sailors, soldiers, airmen on both sides. But now what we see is other countries not looking as much over their shoulder as they're making decisions on their own in their own national security interests. I'll stop at that point and look forward to your further questions, Yuki, and questions from the audience.
Great, thank you both. Admiral Swift, you talked about how you and General Isobe has forged this very close personal relationship. And that is really what this in-person engagement through staff talks, joint exercise, and at the time of the crisis, working together really helps to forge and to continue to strengthen or into your retirement years, as you mentioned. But what the pandemic showed, what this time's coronavirus showed us is sometimes the preventive measure that's required to contain the virus may not be conducive to continue on this close in-person engagement, like training together in the same space, sharing experiences. So if those things can happen, and there's no guarantee that it won't happen again, how does that impact U.S. and Japanese ability to not to engage just with each other to continue buttress this relationship, but then also with the broader security partners in the Indo-Pacific region? And let me start with you, Admiral Scott.
Yeah, so it's a very good point. So in times of stability is when we need to focus on the relationships most. The reason that we've been able to respond so positively to the challenges that we faced in the region, we being Japan and the United States, is because we have this long sustained relationship. My father was stationed in Japan. My first memories ever was living in Yokosuka as a small child. So this, in times of crisis, this allows us to come together very quickly. It is very difficult. Many have said this before. This isn't my thought, but it's very difficult to surge trust. Trust has to be built every day in all of our relationships, especially our national security relationships, like the relationship between Japan and the United States. So I'm less concerned about the impact that COVID has had. We have a clear understanding. Both Japanese government and U.S. government have taken steps to protect their population and protect their military and self-defense force, as we've discussed. And those steps are absolutely compatible because we understand each other. We think in the same way. So there aren't friction points that are created. In fact, those that potential adversaries out there, competitors, look at this, that the seam is not created, despite this separation from a foreign policy perspective, that the U.S. has gone in a different direction globally, not just with respect to Japan. And yet our closest allies and partners have adapted, in my opinion, very well in what my opinion is a negative step away from our close partners, both in Asia and Europe and around the world. So I'm less concerned about what this impact is. The other point I would like to make is that because we do have such strong military and self-defense forces within each country, combined that force is even greater. We're able to take stronger measures to combat the virus than we would if we were in conflict. So there's margin available that if we are in conflict, we can take more risk with our force. We've seen that the vast majority of cases on the carrier in Guam was the loss of taste and smell, that the functionality as far as sailors was largely unimpaired, that they could still execute their mission without any problem. So it's a population that is very low risk. It's a population that is much stronger to, I'm talking about the broad military population, to combat the virus. So we have great capacity with which to surge together if we were to face a threat that the two governments decided to counter together. I'll stop at that point. Thank you.
Thank you. General Isobe?
Yes, thank you, Admiral Swift, for introducing our personal relationship. Before the March 11 Great Eastern Japan earthquake, actually, General Hironaka and myself visited the PACOM headquarters to meet our counterparts, Admiral Swift, and also the J5 at the PACOM at that time. We spent several days starting from breakfast to dinner. It's a very good, intensive discussions in Hawaii. And I think the March 11th, especially the Fukushima nuclear power accident, I think there is similarities between the March 11th and the coronavirus. One is that the enemy is invisible, radioactive, and this is a pandemic virus. And also, these aspects both are very unpredictable. So it is almost like a quasi-war. And I realized at the March 11th, this is the biggest and the worst crisis for Japan after the World War II. But now, 9 years have passed since then, and then we are now experiencing the coronavirus. And this impact is much more greater than March 11th earthquake, because of the influence is not only the victims, affected peoples, but also whole the world people are affected by the coronavirus and the economic area and the daily life. So I think it is very important time for both Japan and the US to cooperate to tackle with this coronavirus. So I would like to say that from the military perspective, we should continue exercise between the two forces. In what ways, in whatever ways, we should continue to do this kind of exercise. Face-to-face is difficult, so we can use this kind of BDCs and maintain a high-level dialogues between the military leaders, but also political leaders. And I think between the Secretary Esper and Minister Kawano, they have been conducted 3 times dialogues in 3 months. And General Yamasaki, our Joint Chief, and the General Miller, Chairman of the Joint Chief, they have also sent a strong message to the world in April 15, using the video conference. And the last point is that back to the basic. So between Japan and the United States, we have a security treaty, and we should be back. We should be back to this treaty of mutual cooperation and security between Japan and the United States of America. And the military experts tend to focus on the military side, Article 5, armed attack. But this treaty also articulates Article 2, so economic cooperation. I quote Article 2. The parties will contribute toward the further development of peaceful and friendly international relations by strengthening their free institutions, by bringing about a better understanding of the principles upon which these institutions are founded, and by promoting conditions of stability and well-being. They will seek to eliminate conflict in their international economic policies and will encourage economic collaboration between them, unquote. So I think now China is emerging and using many coercive methods. So I think we should consider about how to holistic ways our mutual cooperation is very important. So I stop here.
Thank you both. I have several questions that's waiting to be answered, so I'm going to go right into the Q&A. Actually, let me start by two that are specifically addressed to you each. So for General Isobe, I have a question from John McDonald, who actually, this is a clarification question relating to your initial remarks. You mentioned about biological weapons. So his question to you was, do you think that this coronavirus and how it affected the entire world practically, including military operation in some case, will open a path to this type of biological weapons? Because perhaps maybe some bad folks out there see how this coronavirus impacted everybody as like a path to their success of having this much impact and a relatively low cost from the virus. To Admiral Swift, I have a question from Emma Shanlett Avery. Her question to you is, given the outbreaks on Carrier's Roosevelt that you referred to in your initial remarks and the ongoing risk of further infections, how concerned are you about the state of U.S. military readiness in the Indo-Pacific? So I will start from General Isobe because it was more of a clarification question, and then I'll move on to Admiral Swift. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for the question, and I think it's a very difficult to answer. It is very difficult to identify who spread something. It means that some bad intentions they might use that kind of weapons. So it is very difficult clarification, I think. Does it make sense or?
Yeah, Koichi, let me, if I could comment on that, Yuki, and then go into the readiness discussion.
Yes.
I think there's an opportunity with the virus to expand the thinking on bioweapons, that too oftentimes that we have discussions with respect to bioweapons in a military context. Any weapon, when you look at warfare on the operational and strategic level, it may not be directly focused on economies, but that's what the strategic objective is. It is to impact the economy of whoever your enemy is. And so I think I've been thinking for some time that we're too narrow in our concern about bioweapons and how they're applied. So my view is that it's not just, I think the question was being asked in the context of non-state actors or terrorist acts. That is a concern, but the ability of those organizations to develop a virus of the sophistication necessary to match the transmission characteristics of the COVID virus is very limited. But on a national scale, think of a virus that carriers don't even know that they're carriers. They are asymptomatic, so they don't feel ill, but they're transferring the disease. They are infected unknowingly, intentionally, but unknowingly, and they become carriers that carry this virus, around the world or specifically to a country based on visa controls or whatever it may be. And the impact is designed to be economic, not medical necessary. Look at what's happened to the global economy based on this virus. That's what's most troubling to me. So I am sure there are efforts that are ongoing within governments that are very carefully studying the rate of recovery of the different economies, because it's you have to think in terms of, unless you develop a virus, but before you pursued this tactic, if you will, to inoculate your own population, that you would be impacted as well. So it's the diversity and strength of your economy that you would be most concerned about from the collateral damage impact of this. So I hope that there is a much broader discussion, as is generated by the question here, about how we need to think about biological warfare, not just in a national defense perspective, which is where we've been focused on it, but look at it from a national security perspective. Look what it has done to health services. Look what it's done to the economy. I don't have any answers yet. That's just something I've been thinking about for some time. And now the example of the virus is a useful opportunity to sharpen that discussion. And I hope there's more discussions about that. On the readiness piece, I'm always concerned about the readiness of both the U.S. military and our close partners as well. And we work very closely together, as General Isabe pointed out, in common exercises. And we have worked together, self-defense force to U.S. military, sharing best practices about how we control the virus in this unique environment of the military. We live in barracks, we live on ships, we live in areas where it's very difficult to practice social distancing. So there's a close collaboration and coordination between the U.S. and Japan defense forces, as well as other countries as well. But I think that we have margin. It's important that we be transparent and we report. I'm not being critical at all of the media. I do think that the military could have reacted quicker, but I think, and that perspective is in hindsight, we didn't understand the ramifications of the spread. And I think the intentions of the captain of the ship were well intended, but they tended to exacerbate the problem, where it became more of a policy discussion than a medical discussion. And I don't think that was helpful either. So there's some unique elements that occurred with a Theodore Roosevelt. And I think each case needs to be taken individually first and then applied collectively across the larger force, as opposed to what the impact was in this case, in this question, to readiness. But it's a concern, but I have other concerns about readiness as well that, match my concerns where we are with the virus. Thank you.
Thank you. Some people ask actually more than one question. And for those of you who you ask me more than one questions, I'm going to warn you right now that I can only get to one of them. So please forgive me because of the time constraints. Let me group a couple of questions and put it to you both. One is in the larger context of this, how does the world perceives U.S. response to this coronavirus may or may not mean for U.S. leadership position or leader of the architect of the Indo-Pacific region's security architecture. Post-COVID, is a United States a diminishing power in the Pacific, and or at least is there a concern on either of you that it may be perceived as such? And if so, what will be the future of the concept of the free and open Indo-Pacific that the General Isobe referred to in his initial remarks? That's from Commodore Bassan, who's a retired director, Chennai Center for China Studies, and a regional director of a National Maritime Foundation. And there was a similar question from Kevin Mayer. Hi, Kevin. By most measure, U.S. handling of the coronavirus has not been very effective. So do either of you think this undermine the view of the United States in the world and among the security partners and allies as a reliable partner that can be counted on to lead during the crisis? I think those two kind of speaks to this a bigger issue of how United States where United States may come out of this after this immediate crisis is over. So let me start with that.
Yuki, you didn't say who should respond, but let me do a favor for Koichi-san and let me answer first. It puts him in an uncomfortable position to critique another country's approach. So I will group my answer, my response to really all these questions. I don't think it is extraordinary, what I'm about ready to say, that I think since the last election, since the Trump administration has come into power, there's been a much more focus on internal issues than external issues, including relationships. I say internal issues as opposed to focusing on national interests, because I'm of the view that now a country's national interests have to be balanced both within its borders and outside of its borders. The result of that first began with a lot of questioning on the part of our allies, partners, friends, and competitors around the world. And that's why you saw the flurry of engagements. This discussion is about the U.S.-Japanese relationship, but the Prime Minister Abe, made several consequential trips to the United States himself to have a face-to-face discussion with President Trump, so that my sense is so that he could better understand directly exactly what President Trump's thinking was, and for Prime Minister Abe to do the subjective analysis about where the country may be going. But I think it's fair to say that the U.S. has been much more focused inwardly than it has outwardly. I think that the U.S. response to the coronavirus has been an affirmation to countries that have come to the conclusion that they can no longer wait. I spoke earlier about the Free and Open Pacific initiative of Prime Minister Abe. And I would point out his close cooperation with many other leaders in the region, Australia in particular. This started back with TPP And my view is that TPP was really not a economic initiative. It was really an initiative about collaboration and cooperation at the strategic level, setting a rule set that allows countries to cooperate and collaborate, certainly in an economic context, but strengthens those relationships in many other areas as well. Here again, Japan and Australia stepped up, and we have a form of TPP with a door open for the U.S. to enter, but it's still moving forward. So I think the coronavirus has been an affirmation of the steps that other countries have been taking based on their assessment of an absence of U.S. leadership. The other question was, post COVID, is U.S. power diminishing? I don't think it's diminishing. This is a subtle difference. I would say U.S. power has diminished, but I think we can rapidly come back if there's a shift in theory and strategy that realizes that national strength is a balance between internal resources and external relationships. I think we can rapidly recover to the stability on the global stage. It's not just in the Indo-Asia-Pacific. We see it in NATO as well. But my greatest concern about this diminished leadership of the United States beyond our borders is a diminishment in deterrence. And so we've seen a rise in others. We've seen it in North Korea. We've seen it with Iran. We've seen it with China. I think that increased level of confidence has been reflective of this diminished deterrence level because of this lack of U.S. leadership on the global stage. And I commend those countries that have stepped forward, Japan and Australia in particular in the Pacific, to fill that gap that has been created. Thank you.
Thank you. I think before I go to you, General Isobe, let me put this final question to both of you. And I'm really sorry for those I couldn't get to for your questions, because this really kind of brings back everything that you've been sharing with us this morning. Is there are more than 3 people have asked that given all that's been happening and based on what you've been sharing with us, how do each of you think important is the U.S. Japan Defense Corporation or Alliance Corporation in trying to develop the regional security order in the Indo-Pacific region moving forward, especially when, as General Isobe pointed out in his initial remarks, that in this time of pandemic crisis, Chinese activities in the areas like South China Sea and East China Sea really hasn't slowed down. If anything, there is some acceleration of their activities in their aspect. So since Admiral Swift did the favor to Isobe-san last time, I will ask General Isobe to start this time, and then I'll let Admiral Swift finish off.
Thank you very much. And about how to resume normal status, I think the economic activities is very important. So the Japanese government is trying to open airports with the partners like Australia, New Zealand, Vietnam, Singapore. So I think this kind of an economic activities is very important for the stability of the region. And another aspect is the point is look at the situation in Hong Kong. National security law enactment is now going on by the mainland China. So I think that the next focal point would become Taiwan. So I think that the US and Japan should cooperate with how to strengthen the stability of the cross straits issues, and also the South China Seas. That's my points. Thank you.
Thank you. Emma Swift?
So a couple of points I would make on this, on the defense relationship. Now, the defense relationship now is that the United States has with Japan and other countries as well. We have five defense treaty partners in the Pacific, 7 globally, is more critical now than ever because of the reputational position that the U.S. has globally. So if these relationships were to be broken, they're strained now, but if they became broken, this would create strategic instability well beyond what I describe as regional instability that's occurring now. You know, the instability in the South China Sea, the East China Sea, other areas as well. So now these relationships are as critical as ever. I go back to how important it is to strengthen these relationships in times of stability. And there's, other than between senior people in government and senior people in the military, sometimes people ask the question, why? You know, why does the U.S. Maintain forces in Japan? What are they needed for? Well, they're needed in times like the Great Eastern Earthquake, or they're needed in times when there's a virus that increases the national security vulnerabilities that we have that others may want to take advantage of. So I think we need to redouble our efforts at every level, webinars such as this, to highlight how important the relationship is between Japan and the U.S. and that it's strategic. It's not just a national defense relationship. It's a national security relationship. It's a strategic relationship. I think that Koichi-san is exactly right on Taiwan. Taiwan is too much of a U.S.-China dialogue. It needs to be a much broader dialogue to include others. The other point that I'll make, it kind of goes back to my last point on the relationship. It's not useful to have this discussion about burden sharing. It's very difficult to measure financially the value of a relationship, of a strategic relationship. It's easy to measure from a financial perspective how much money the U.S. Pays for forces in Japan, but the return on investment that we get strategically is astronomical, that we, the U.S., get. Yes, the Japanese are advantaged as well. So I think it's very important that we continue to have these discussions that address the points that those that may be more narrow-minded are bringing up about the costs that are associated, and Korea needs to pay more, Japan needs to pay more, whatever it may be. We need a much broader discussion if we're going to maintain the stability that we've enjoyed since the end of World War II, which is really based on the strength of the relationship. But thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, thank you, General Sobe. Thank you, Admiral Swift, for joining us this morning, and for General Sobe staying up so late in the evening in Tokyo. And again, for those of you whose a question I couldn't get to it, I really apologize. There's this time limit with like 45 minutes. I'm still learning how to optimize that. But I would like to thank all of you for channeling in from all over the world. We actually got questions from Europe, not only just Asia and in the US. So this is, I think, one benefit of the webinar that Stimson here at the Japan program would like to continue to take advantage of. So hopefully you all can channel again when we do a similar webinar. But let me just finish up by saying thanks for joining us, and thank you for the both speakers for sharing your thoughts with us this morning. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Yuki. Good to see you, Koichi-san.
All right.